it's really a great segue to you, Arjun. We've also seen that we're going to have 1.4 trillion in investment in infrastructure in India. That's what's been promised. And when you think about the scale of what's required, what do you think that the government needs to do to create that enabling environment for more sustainable and resilient infrastructure in India?
Thank you, Lauren. So India finally has an infrastructure program that it deserves. And 1.5 trillion will be invested over the next 5 years. And for India to be part of the Committee of Nations, it needs to do this admirably. Track record so far has actually been very good. For example, we have the second largest road network in the world. And on that very large base, we're executing about 50 kilometers of national highways daily. That translates to about 18,000 kilometers annually, which on an annual basis is the size of many national highway networks in most other countries. On the renewable front, and to actually also bolster our energy security, we have about 18,000 megawatts of renewable power come online every year, and I could go on. Now, India is the 6th largest economy in the world, 3rd on a purchasing power parity perspective, and the Indian economy has actually been built by Indians and Indian businesses. Now, as an emerging market, there are certainly huge challenges, and at the same time, there are huge opportunities, not just for Indian businesses, but for the entire world. Now, I can appreciate that entry into the Indian market does have its challenges, and a number of issues come to mind, but I'll name 2 in the context of the current conversation. First, adequate and appropriate risk sharing between government and private sector. The second is contract enforcement and swift dispute resolution. And I think our government and especially our Prime Minister is especially aware of some of these issues, and there's an ongoing dialogue to actually make some of these things better. And by the way, the WEF is wonderfully placed to actually assist in some of this dialogue as well. So I'll conclude by saying that the preparatory work that goes into creating and planning and executing this $1.5 trillion of infrastructure, we have to get it right, is something that's so fundamentally important that requires for India to engage with all its partners in the globe for the purpose of best practices, so that we're able to execute infrastructure that is productive and sustainable.
Thank you, Arjun. And I do want to come back later to some of the other actions we need to do to get it right. Before, Arjun, when we come to what's happening in India, we talked actually before this session about what's happening nationally. And I thought it was very interesting when Governor Hogan was talking about what's happening in the state to provide the state with resources for that infrastructure transformation. Can you talk a little bit about some of the models that are being used in India, and what are you most hopeful about in terms of those examples for new models of infrastructure?
Sure. So a few comments on urban infrastructure planning. This is so fundamental as India urbanizes. We do it a little differently from the way it's done in the West, and it's not optimal. You have state agencies do central planning and take responsibility for execution, and local authorities and city authorities and municipal authorities are given less autonomy. And this creates a problem. I mean, you take the example of Mumbai. The mayor of the city it's ceremonial post. And so I think as we start to plan infrastructure for smart cities, as we've been discussing, not for 5 years or 10, but for the next 50, I think that you have to first actually involve as many stakeholders as you can locally, give them the authority, local autonomy in planning infrastructure that's more sustainable, that's more productive. Second, I think we have to, as an industry, continue to innovate. HCC, for example, we use fly ash in the production of our concrete to reduce the amount of cement that we use. The planning needs to take into account water conservation. We don't talk about water enough, so our projects are net water positive over the life cycle of the project. And then technology has made a huge difference in this last number of years. So your projects are planned better, so there's less wastage, procurement is more efficient. And then you have, most importantly, our structures end up being much lighter. Now, I think that there's younger politicians in our country, who appreciate, what we're talking about. And certainly, I think that we've, on the subject of public-private partnership, it is so fundamentally important, as part of any infrastructure development that takes place around the world. On one hand, you actually have the best practices that PPP brings in design, in operations and maintenance for the life cycle of the project, but there's also the all-important question of financing. And as soon as you start to de-bottleneck a lot of what we talked about, the cost of infrastructure, as we've talked about, ends up becoming less expensive. The premiums that you end up, on project finance and equity allow for then more infrastructure to get built with less capital.
Thank you for that. And there's so much to dig into there in terms of some of the initiatives of the Indian government, whether it's the Smart Cities Initiative or Swachh, where they've created a lot of special purpose vehicles for investment with city level and with state level, and that probably deserves its own session. But we have a couple of questions here. I would like to direct the question about how we make sure infrastructure dollars are well spent to you, Governor Hogan, in terms of how we incentivize green investment to come into our city, especially in emerging markets. If I could ask you to respond to that, Lord Stern, and maybe also Arjun, if you would speak to that. And then the issue of bringing technology into the O&M, right, the operations and management of this, if you could speak to that, Florence. And then in terms of protecting people, Jonathan, if you can speak to what you're seeing in terms of heat management, and Arjun as well. We know it's been over 120 degrees in India in the past couple of weeks, major heat waves affecting the people there. So let's try to go for that. If you can try to keep your answers to about a minute, and then I'm going to have to bring us to a close. Arjun.
So on the PPP, I think where governments tend to discount that last P, which is partnership. And certainly India's had a very, very successful run at PPP. We've had our hiccups initially. We've created those constitutions and those framework agreements that now govern concessions. And the program has really scaled in the last 7 years. But not enough can be said about swift dispute resolution. And Lord Stern said this, planning is fundamental. The quality of project reports and bringing infrastructure projects that are well planned to market is just fundamental. To the point on incentives for green, I think that health, safety, environment need to become a unit part of work. And I think that if governments, financial institutions actually create the incentives for requiring that to actually happen in some small way, I think that will actually go create a habit for people and industry to start thinking in a positive fashion.